Comadres. Welcome to another episode of Comadreando podcast. I'm your host, Marcy, and today we have an amazing guest. Her name is Miriam, and I will let her introduce herself. Who are you?
Pues primero, thank you, gracias por invitarme. My name is Miriam Lara Mejia, and I am a body positivity educator, activist, and content creator, most known in social media as La Gorda Feminista. And my mission is to be part of the movement to create a world where all bodies fit and, to fight through the systems that oppress people because of our body size.
Amazing. So I usually tell the comadres how I met my guests. Miriam and I started following each other, I want to say like a year and a half ago, something like that, after I started the podcast. I started seeing her on my stories, advocating for body positivity rights and basically being a badass and doing away with all the stigmas and everything that we've been raised with, especially in Latino culture, with regards to body sizes and what is quote unquote healthy or not. So that after that, I was like, oh my God. And then she went to a conference in California and I was just like, oh my God, I need her on my show. So eventually I reached out and she accepted the invitation, which I'm so thankful that you did. And she's like just the right person to bring on to talk about today's topic, which is raising body positive children. And the reason why I chose the topic for today is that since this generation of parents, myself included and Miriam included as well, because we're about the same age, is doing so much work breaking away from stereotypes and disrupting the status quo, we want to help other parents help break stigmas around our bodies and empower our children to have healthy relationships with food and their bodies. So before we get into the actual topic, I'm going to get a couple of ¿cómo se dice? Pormenores, details out of the way. What is your career?
So my academic career was in anthropology and gender studies. And then I dedicated most of my working life to, I would say 15 years, to health literacy, the idea of creating content around health that is about creating power for people with a specific focus that's called popular education. It's sort of this education for liberation theology that started in Brazil. And the idea is that, we can, when we want to create change for people, when we want to create better lives and better health and everything, we have to start where people are. And we have to provide resources, information, connect the dots, right? Always from the experience to like the bigger topics, right? Like nothing that we do that is systemically harmful is just our own invention, like, right? You're not just you didn't just invent racism in your mind, right? It's a system, it's a culture, it has years of backing and it's baked into all of our society. So, and now I consider myself again like an educator and a speaker on the topic of how to build more positive relationships to our bodies, with our bodies, and through a lot of the topics, right? Like through fighting fatphobia, through thinking about more intuitive eating, through movement for all bodies. And one of the elements that has become kind of salient in my work has become this piece around body positive parenting and how to be really conscious about how we bring these concepts of liberation, right? Like body liberation, around our kids, and how as we are healing our bodies, and we're all in this process, like no one's reached the other shore, right? We're all constantly being bombarded with messages in all of our spaces, right? In the medical office, in the schools, in media, in airplanes, everywhere we're bombarded with this message that people in larger bodies are lesser humans because we have larger bodies. And so we're in this constant process as we're trying to work through those messages and retain our sense of our self-worth and love in a world that is oppressing us through these mechanisms. We want to teach that, right? And that is one of the pieces that people are interested in, right? As you said, like people of our generation who are like, we're waking up to like, I've shared recently like to someone, and I was like, I have been an activist. My parents were activists. So, worker rights and environmental rights and women's rights. But for a long part of my life, I thought that, yes, all the things that were happening to me because of my larger body were my fault, right? I could see how it was unjust in all these different ways. But this idea that, like, you are fat because you want to be fat, or you are fat because you're not a good person, or you're fat because you're lazy, all these stereotypes that we're bringing, right? These really heavy things are social constructs. We like built them, we created them. They're not, they're really meant to oppress people. And so waking up to that and sort of being like, I want to change that for myself. Now it's like, yes, like how do we do that for not only for our kids, because I'm also really deeply committed to like, how do we take this message to our tias, our abuelas, not that I'm saying like, I know, we cannot change people, but we can definitely create ways to bring this information and this liberation to all people, not believing that we can do that for our older generations.
Yeah. I love that because I'm such a like advocate for us being comfortable in our own bodies and loving ourselves through all our shapes. Because the thing is, our shape changes throughout the whole year. Nobody is static, right?
Yeah.
In the winter, I put on a couple of pounds. In the summer, I lose a couple of pounds. Sometimes I just stay the same weight for a very long time. And the thing is that teaching people to love themselves throughout it all, regardless. Yes, we do have body goals, but how much of those body goals are really like us wanting to actually have those goals, or is it imposed by society to us? So a lot of that stuff.
And how much are we doing?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Like, like what do we do? Are we really doing what's healthiest for us, right? Like if your base weight is a certain weight, right? And you're doing all these things to change it, like, and then you go back to that same way, right? Like this is sort of like really respecting and honoring that we are different, right? That there is no goal body, right? And also really to contest this idea that there is an ideal body, because that ideal body comes from white supremacy, comes from European standards, comes from, this violence around bodies, right? And we cannot deny, like, when you start learning that fatphobia it originates in, when Europeans went to Africa and basically violated everybody and, took them to the Americas, they dehumanized Black people, and they dehumanized their bodies, their different bodies from Europeans. And that's the origin of fatphobia, right? And so when you know that it's a racist mechanism, right? It's through that we build all these other things. You really start to question why we continue to perpetuate fatphobia in our societies, right? And then, there's just so much information around what fatphobia is as a bias. But right now, we like people who study biases, like for example, in Harvard University, they have a whole department that studies biases, right? Like how do we, racism and homophobia and all these different ways in which we create divisions in our humanity. And they found many things have become less socially acceptable. Doesn't mean that they disappear, but fatphobia, anti-fat bias is the only one that has continued to increase, right? So that really tells us that fatphobia has become this sort of umbrella for a lot of our biases, right? Like we hide, especially, for me, this interest in like the Latinx community is like a lot of the biases against Latinx people are kind of hiding underneath fatphobia. A lot of biases against people with disabilities who cannot move their bodies, like, they're like, move your body. It's like they can't move their bodies. They like hides underneath fatphobia. And let's talk about racism is profoundly, the people who are most impacted are like bigger people with larger bodies who are Black and who are brown and who are disabled, right? So like there's a lot to really question here, and a lot of power and synergy of making these connections. Whoa, how do we, this is a really important social justice issue that we can really, as you said, like you and I, muchas personas, lots of people are like, I want to I want it to be different for myself and for my kids.
Yes. And the thing is that it just like really drives me crazy. The way that we're socialized so much that somebody gives you a compliment, ay, estás bien linda, right? Estás bien flaca, estás bien linda. They associate skinniness with prettiness. Like that has nothing to do with the other thing.
Yeah.
But automatically in some of our elders' minds, like some of the older generations, they give you a compliment, but instead of actually giving you a compliment about something that is tangible, they're telling you, oh, rebajaste, te ves más bonita, you lost weight, you look better, right? Which shouldn't be something like that. And then, teaching the older generation about what's a compliment and not to make comments about people's weight, regardless if they're skinny or bigger, it doesn't matter. Like, they have a mirror in their house. That's one thing that I love to tell people. And like when I get like really sassy, I'm like, sí, yo tengo un espejo, muchas gracias. I have a mirror in my house, thank you very much. Yeah. Like, I don't need your input about my body size. Like, it's something that is so pervasive and it's so toxic in Latino communities. And I can't speak to other communities because I wasn't raised in another community. I was raised, in Washington Heights. I'm Dominican, and that was my experience growing up, especially being la gordita de la familia, the chubby one of the family.
Right.
Okay, so going in that vein, what was it like growing up in a traditional Latino household? You told me your parents were activists. So, but what was their view of body sizes and things like that?
Yeah. So I grew up in Mexico, but I didn't grow up in a traditional Mexican household because my mom was from Wisconsin. So she was an immigrant to Mexico from Wisconsin. And I always say this, like, even though, part of the things that really kind of protected me from the violence of fatphobia was that I grew up in a feminist household. My mom had a larger body, and, this is something that's really important to talk about, because when we talk about these social issues, often we think like there's people who are racist and there's people who are not racist, and there's people who are fatphobic and there's people that are not fatphobic. And the truth is, we grew up in this society that has elevated some bodies and some qualities, right, of people, right? And so we all grew up, most of us grew up thinking like whiter is better and like skinnier is better, right? Like these are all the sort of the violence of beauty, right? And that is, again, built on European, built on white supremacy. But my mom, I don't remember my mom ever not being in a diet. And now, as I've been kind of getting myself educated and learning more about kind of the impact that family has on developing body issues, developing, eating disorders, developing, one of the biggest influence on that is whether your mom, especially, that's, there's also questions about why that's only studied, right? Like, but we have very strong evidence that if the mom diets, that's a huge impact over how you think of what's good and what's bad, what you should be doing. You should constantly be doing something to lose weight, right? So I don't remember a time where she wasn't trying to lose weight. And I always kind of, I've shared this in my story, but when my mom developed Alzheimer's and she started losing weight, right, because a lot of people stopped being able to eat the same. And we would walk in, my brother would take her for walks, and people would be like, "Hi, Miss Mary. Wow, es que usted se ve muy bien. You look so good," right? And here's my mom with like 4 years of like really, the most, Alzheimer's is a truly horrific, just painful disease, right? But for people, they were like, "This is such a wow, Mary," And I also shared, like, if my mom had seen herself in that size, I don't know, maybe she would have been like, yes, el sacrificio valió la pena, right? Like, I would have, many people say those things, right? And so I also, very early on in my life, though, grew up with sort of like, my grandfather had a fat body, and my uncle and my mom had a fat body, and we had a fat body. So it was really early on that I sort of understood what we now know, which is like, body size is very strongly determined by your genetics, right? Like 60-80%. And And like that kind of like also shaped some of my activism. At the same time, I think that especially in the Latino communities, but actually I've seen it in a lot of places, but I, was able to travel in the world, and I've shared, like, I've gone to very fat positive countries and very fat negative countries. But in most countries, what happens is like, we want younger people to be really skinny, like you before you get married, you better be like this size, right? So that idea of control, right? And then you see women who are married have larger bodies because their bodies were meant to be larger, right? They were meant to be larger, but they were doing all these things to kind of change it because we have all this other, not machismo, sexismo, violencia, misoginia, all these other things that are interfering with how we think about women's bodies, especially. It doesn't mean that fatphobia doesn't impact, everybody else, but it just like means that, women are, and again, like women and when BIPOC women, especially. So again, yeah, I grew up in a non-traditional Latino home. And then when I started making content, kind of like talking about, las tías, so my husband is Colombian from New York. And so that was kind of the first time that I really saw just how toxic and violent this language around bodies is, right? And I started making content about it. And then, I just like a volcano, like I just like started hearing so many things. That was just like such a shared experience, right? And yeah, that's part of like how what shaped my work and what I'm doing.
It's so like you're telling me all these things, and I'm getting like flashbacks from when I was a younger girl. I was in high school, and I want to say I was like 150 pounds, like after I was 16, and at that time I thought I was like the biggest I have ever been, right? Because all the girls around me were like 00, like nothing, basically a zero number for jean size, and I was a size 10. And I remember feeling so big, and then it wasn't until I went into like a deep severe state of depression that I got bigger than the size that I was. And then I'm like, wow, I wish I was that size again, right? But in that moment, because you grow up with this stigma of like, I have to lose weight, I have to lose weight, I have to lose weight, you don't like enjoy your body how it is at that moment. You don't really, I feel like it's like body dysmorphia in a way, right? Because you're not really seeing yourself, how beautiful you are. You have this image of what you're supposed to look like, and that interferes with you actually enjoying your body and enjoying food and like being like present in the moment, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I think, one of the questions that I often start workshops with is like, tell me who in your family, especially women, who loves their bodies? Who? Right? And then you start noticing that like ni la güerita, ni la altota, ni the fat one, ni the skin one, nobody is liking their bodies, right? So that tells us that there's a system in place. And we now know, we know there's a strong, the marketing industry, right? That is constantly selling us things through this lens of like, you want that kind of thing, you want that kind of hair, you want that kind of that, right? In this sort of like constant, but no one is ever going to reach that because the thing is, they have to sell us these things. So when you start learning, for example, about radical self-love, and you realize we were born kind of like we were all born, existing. We were all born knowing when we were hungry, right? Knowing when we wanted to move and sleep. And then we learn all these ways, right, of what is good and what is bad. And we kind of detached, right? Like, the whole idea of like listening to your hunger. And then, this is the piece, right? Like, we know that one of the most important predictors of weight gain in the future is dieting, right? And most people start their diets in the US like at 8 to 12, right? So very, very young. We're already starting to disassociate from our bodies, right? We don't know when we want to eat because we are like, okay, if I'm hungry, I'm going to drink some water. And it's like that is disordered, like we can eat in so many different ways that nourishes our body. So, definitely the question of like how we are all everybody, if you're young or old, or your hair is this or your whatever, we're all dissatisfied with our body. That is a sign for us that there's a system in place, and then we must question it, right? Because yeah, you and I are totally, we're different bodies and different lots of things, right? And yet we're both part of this diversity, and that's the core part, is like diversity has always been the only truth. We are all different, and so how can we create worlds where all bodies fit?
That's the biggest thing that I'm trying to create with the show, because my show is geared towards educating Black and Brown communities about disabilities and things like that, but also creating accepting environments for everybody. It doesn't matter what you look like, what your disability is, whether you're neurodiverse or you're neurotypical. I want to be able to create inclusive environments for everyone, that everybody feels comfortable being themselves. Miriam, so I wanted to ask you, what was your relationship like with food, since you grew up in a different type of household?
I mean, as most people, food is a deeply important part of my life. I have done so many diets, like, again, most people who are listening here, and that is something that, when we start really researching the data on diets, and you're like, oh, actually, it turns out study after study shows, like, people who do diets, like 95 to 98% regain all the weight that they lost, right? So you're like, oh, wait, is it us or is it the diet, right? And like 2/3 regain more weight, right? That's how it becomes that, doing the first diet is the predictor of weight gain. But the truth is that there was, because, and I wonder, I've kind of interested in like talking more about this, but like, because my mom was an immigrant from the US in Mexico, food had a kind of like, like a very important part. Like when we would get, and what's funny is like my mom grew up in the 50s, right? So a lot of her food are these foods that we now demonize, right? Like, I don't know, certain kinds of, I don't know, Campbell's soup, right? Like that was like, oh my gosh, someone brought Campbell's soup from Mexico City. Right, the origin kind of processed food held a lot of weight for her. So food was it's a deeply like, identity oriented. And but now, for example, I got diagnosed with ADHD like 4 years ago, and now I'm like looking at my mom, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of disordered ways in which she ate that are associated with people who have ADHD as well, right? Like just like different textural issues and whatever. But I feel like because my mom had to hold on to kind of her foods, I have this deep, profound connection to food. And so even though I did diets, I never really, like most people, stayed on the diet. And I'm very clear when the last diet that I did, which was 10 years ago, and it was one of those like meat eater, like you only eat like meat and like bone broth and all these different things. And I remember having kind of like this moment where I was like, after like a week or something, I was like, I'm depressed, and I suffered depression. So I kind of could recognize like, I'm entering depression right now. I feel this. And I was like, it is this diet. And before even knowing the science behind why diets don't work and who makes these diets, like no one who ever has any research is making these diets of like what you should eat. So yeah, for me, food is deeply, but I don't know if you've heard this, but like there's been a TikTok kind of trend talking about homes, and like my home is definitely an ingredient home. And what I mean by that is like, I love cooking. And so you can, unfortunately, I have a lot of privilege because I have time to cook. This is not a position of like people who have, there's just like so many points of privilege for me. But I grew up also in an ingredient home, like, making bread and making cookies and, like all these different things that feel deeply connected to my food. But one of my older sisters, who is a person who has continued to diet through her life, she recently was telling me like that she feels that because she hasn't kind of processed this piece around food, that she definitely feels like a lot of out of control feelings around food. Like I don't have that anymore. The moment I switch to kind of more intuitive eating, sort of like this idea that I will eat, when I'm hungry, what I want, what I like. It has really switched my relationship with food. And the truth is, like, my husband, again, my Colombian husband, I saw this for him when I don't know if this has happened to you, but like when I met him, he'd be like, no podemos comprar galletas. We cannot buy any cookies because if there's cookies in the house, I'm going to eat them all. And I was like, that is disordered eating. That means that, and now, I like actually want to make a video. Like I have cookies, chocolates, this, just so many things in the house. And we eat one or two if you want it, like it no longer has a hold on us. And that's like something just so powerful of like how to relate with food in a different way.
I don't know. I don't know what it was, but growing up, my relationship with food was like I wanted to eat, but then because my mom had a very toxic relationship with food, she would control the amount that I was eating, and she would tell me that I wasn't hungry. So I ended up stealing food, which obviously has psychological stuff. Like we're not gonna get into that on the show today.
Yeah.
Pero the feeling that I would eat and hide what I was eating was insane, and the fact that I couldn't talk about it was another, like, an added layer to that, and then I feel like my relationship with food started changing more as I became more independent and I became an adult and I was a mom myself, because I don't feel like I exercise the same amount of control over what my son eats, especially because he's on the spectrum. There's certain things that he doesn't eat and he won't tolerate. So that dynamic that I grew up with is definitely not in my household now, but like I feel like I have a more positive relationship with food now. Definitely, like it's like I used to be like your husband, like si hay galletas me la voy a comer todas, right? But like now it's more like I get different like little treats here and there, but they'll stay in the pantry for a very long time because like I'll eat one or two and then I'm satisfied. It doesn't have that control anymore.
And there's deep science around that, right? And I mean, for me, what's interesting around the immigrant experience, right? Like, again, like because my mom would get these things, like shipped from wherever, these, things that we now would be like, oh my gosh, marshmallow and things that like are just like we associate with so many bad things. But what's interesting for a lot of my community who are part of the Gorda Feminista is like, for many immigrants, like food is, this form of identity, right? And so like people make this big meals, this pozole, tamales, or lo que sea. And then, right, and it's like, I'm making this out of love or connection with your culture, but then people get shamed for eating it, right? So it's like you get shamed for not eating it because it's like this big thing that people are preparing, and then you're shamed for it's sort of this interesting dynamic that I'm curious, like, how do we balance it, right? Like either you're making 100 tamales and for 2 people, like, of course, we're going to eat like so many tamales. How do we balance that with like not shaming people for eating the food that we're saying that you should eat? So it's kind of an interesting connection around with immigrant communities.
I know it's very interesting. It's like, especially around the holiday time, right? In Mexico se hace muchos tamales. In Mexico, they make a lot of tamales. Dominican Republic, we make all kinds of different stuff. We, especially here in the United States, like we integrated other dishes from other countries that are not necessarily quote unquote the healthiest, but it's there. But then you're making all this food, yet you're watching what the person is putting on their plate. Like it's exactly what you're saying. Like, why are you watching what the person is eating? Like, are we gonna? So we're cooking just to waste the food, or are we cooking to eat? Like there has to be some kind of balance there.
Yeah.
So growing up in that kind of environment, did it affect your mental health a little bit? You said you suffer from depression, or is it just something that developed from when you were younger?
I mean, mental health is part of my family's history. My grandmother had depression. I don't know. My mom, passed away, so I don't know if she identified with having depression or got diagnosed. I did get diagnosed. I would say that, growing up in a feminist home really kind of gave me a sense of like I deserve to exist, which I think is a dynamic that doesn't exist in homes that are not feminist and are fatphobic. Like my home was fatphobic. This idea of like you are not good if you have a certain size. But I did, I now that I'm like getting more educated around fatphobia and anti-fat stigma and all these different things, I can look back and be like, wow, that thing that was really hurtful was related to weight stigma. I just didn't think about it that way, because when you're fat and you don't question fat phobia, you think you deserve it. You think that you deserve to be treated this way or that way, because why don't you just stop being fat, right? Like we are all embedded with this idea, like just stop being fat. And that's not how it works, right? Like so I definitely went through in my 20s a little bit of like not honoring myself, because I had boyfriends who were like, I have one boyfriend in Mexico who was like, if you lose 10 kilos, which is like 22 pounds, like then I'll take you to Italy or something like that. He still took me to Italy, lose the weight, but it was like a guilt thing, right? This, oh my gosh, you have to lose this weight. Or how many, I'm sure you know the list. Everybody has a list of like what things have happened in their lives. So I definitely in my 20s, I did kind of lose a little bit of like that thought. And then in my 30s, my early 30s, I was like, oh, I want to be healthy. And I associated healthy with skinny. And this is an important thing to always remind ourselves, like health is enormous and it has many determinants. You can look at this website called determinantsofhealth.org, and you can see what they are. And size is not a determinant of health, okay? It's not. Your patterns, your genetics, your environment, how much you sleep or control your stress, all these things impact. If you smoke or do drugs, all these things impact your health. And eating and exercise are a part of it, but not a humongous part of it. But for for a long time, I sort of associated skinny with healthy. So I did a lot of things to change my size, and then was really impacted when my size didn't change, because at the end of the day, those things don't really, really impact on the long term. So now I feel like really when I switched a lot of my thinking and really understood, like, I want to eat nutritiously and varied, and like from a place of like intuition, and I want to move my body, not to lose weight or get la pompa or get anything, just to move my body because it helps with my stress and my parenting and my pelvic floor, and there's all these things. And like, I want to control my stress. I don't want to think that I have to be different to be worthy, right? And now we know, like I've been reading research around like self-compassion and self-acceptance, and how these are like very important elements to our health. Like when you can like be like, I am good, I'm a good person, I feel good, who I am, then you can do a lot of things for your health, and you can do a lot of things that make you feel good and are promoting of your health. And so, balancing that with depression has always been hard, because for me, definitely like there's a lot of aspects to depression, and I feel like whoever's listening to, it's just like a complicated thing, right? Like we think like, oh, it's depression, it's like this barrier. It's not. Having postpartum depression was particularly hard, and I do think postpartum depression, there was definitely an element around body, right? Like, because what you said earlier, right? We are brought up to believe that bodies don't change. Like, try to be, when you were 20, or you should try to be like your body when you were, before you had a baby. And it's like, no, like my body is officially transformed, right? But we are carrying a lot of this, like, oh no, body shouldn't change. You should not this. You should not have this. You should not have arrugas. You should not have this. You should not have the bump. And it's like, no, but I do have those. Like, what do I do now that I do have them, right? So there was a little bit of loss. I had other things, right? Like I had difficulty breastfeeding, blah, 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 blah. That contributed to my postpartum depression. But I definitely feel like a little bit of the sorrow and grief of body change, right? And a lot of people who, if you went through the pandemic and our bodies changed for a lot of people, and it's like there's a lot of grief because we've been told your body does not change. You should not let your body change. And it's like, yeah, it does. Like, you should not look like you did before. And it could be different for many people, right? Weight gain is, in fact, actually evolutionarily important for bigger, as you get older, right? These are all things that we kind of are not used to thinking. So, and like the ups and downs of like really being able to kind of accept myself. I feel like, as you said, like when you have a disability or when you have other things that are challenging, in a world like the disability is not the challenging thing, but it's like the world built around excluding people with disabilities, so people who are neurodivergent or whatever. So like being able to accept you through all of these different things when you're told like you have to be this way to be good, and if you're this way you're not good, right? Like this applies for kind of the whole continuum of like diversity. And now I'm like really trying to working on that. Like I've done a lot of work on my self-acceptance, but for me it's really hard to be like, okay, here are the ways that I function that feel like they're not good because the world is telling me they're not good, but like how do I build self-acceptance and self-compassion kind of throughout my whole life, not just like through my body. And that has really kind of helped, give it. And then, I would say like I grew up in I don't know, like in a home that was like kind of like more about healing through herbs and teas and whatever. And so that's the way that I kind of maintain my mental health through the tools that I have built around that.
I love that. What was I gonna say, Miriam? It how has so all this knowledge, I love that you have like actively taught yourself, and you've gone to look beyond what we've been taught, growing up. How has that helped you mother in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, when I feel like this is such a common experience, but when you have a child, suddenly you just like imagine a world where your child will always know that they're precious, right? That you have this awareness of like how when we are born, we are precious. And becoming a parent suddenly brought forward for me what I wanted that to look like. What world needed to be built for my child with all his ways in which he is him he could both know truly deeply that he is worthy, and that a world where like he could see that other people are different and everybody's different, like everybody's different, and that could be celebrated. So um, a lot of my work, especially like after the first year, because for me, the first year was really hard. Maybe, I don't know, for some parents it is. Now that as soon as I got diagnosed with ADHD, I was like, oh, that's why that was like, if it's hard for me to like brush my teeth, like it's just like viscerally impossible for me to brush your teeth when you don't even want to have your teeth brushed. Like, that a lot of this stuff now working through self-compassion. So when I realized that, so much, like this research around body image, we know body image is a cimiento. It's a important basis of our well-being and our happiness and our capacity to do health things for ourselves. And so, in order for me, as like I am healing, and I would say healing because I feel like this is a perpetual process. Unfortunately, this is not a destination. This is a constant, right? And so as it got easier for me, as I practiced more self-compassion, self-acceptance, more centering diversity in my life, in myself, in understanding how I'm part of this diverse world. I'm not either good or bad. I'm just here, right? While also acknowledging incredible privilege, right? Being a light-skinned Latina, an American Latina, whatever. Having, being born in a country where I still have the papers to, work legally, all these things, right? Like there's a lot of privilege that I have. And I also don't live with my suegra who would constantly be bombarding me, right, about my body. Like there's people who live like that, and that's really hard. But so I realized like I want my child to just absolutely know that all the forms in which he's diverse and unique are great. And so that got me kind of like thinking, like about body image. How do we build someone's body image? How do we build someone's capacity to also acknowledge and see and celebrate diversity, right? So a lot of the work with my child is like, like for example, like you ves esas flores, you see those flowers there, they're bigger than these flowers, but it doesn't matter because those flowers are that flowers and those flowers are that flowers. They're no comparisons, right? Like there's just like, this is how the world is. It's just diverse. Really consuming diverse things. And like, I feel like we live in an era now, for example, like on Netflix and stuff like that, you can really search for things that show people in very, very diverse people, right? um and like really encouraging this sense. I make a big effort of talking about my body in positive ways. I never grew up with that. My mom never talked about her body in a positive way. I want him to see, yeah, like, we take baths together because my son's 4, and like, my panza está ahí, and it's like playful, and I want him to hear me say mi panza gorda es hermosa. I want him to hear that part, right? Like that
Yeah.
my body is able, my body is good, because that, unfortunately, we have to be the model, right? Like and as a parenting, like we want to teach our kids all these
Yeah.
things, but you have to live it. You have to be it. Yes, around food, like, yes, with people, and he's not diagnosed or anything, but I can see that there's a lot of things of how he eats that are very similar to things that I have. And yes, how do we encourage like intuitive eating, like recognize your hunger, and like all these different things, right? But it really comes from like the most, I feel like, the basic need for almost all parents, that is like, I want my kid to go into this world and be able to feel he deserves to exist, and he's beautiful and amazing as he is.
I love that. I was actually this week, right before when we were emailing each other back and forth to secure the appointment, I saw this reel on Instagram that said that there's a psychological difference, the way that your body absorbs the food when you are thinking diet, and there's a difference when you're thinking abundance. Because like you can have the same exact salad, but cuando tú estás pensando, when you're thinking I'm on a diet, the way that you absorb the nutrients is different than when you're thinking like I'm just having this salad to have this salad because this is what I'm thinking. Which is amazing, because like I feel like the human body is incredible, but then also like the mind is something that is just not,
I would say, the whole idea of like food, right? Like when we really listen to our bodies, right? And listen to our hunger and listen to our antojos, right? There's a lot of information. I feel like, when I there's a book that, that kind of does all this research around like, what is the function of fat in our body, right? Because, so much of like diet culture teaches us like fat is like the worst, como lo tienes, that's the worst thing. And actually like fat is like informing your brain, like the fatness in the fat parts of your body, the fat in your body informs your brain, like when you're satiated, when you're hungry, what you need more from, right? And it's just like this interesting thing about how we've demonized this part. Like this is a part of our body. Fat is a part of our body. Like how does it help us know our bodies, right? And I do think like for little kids, it's like so, and I mean, I don't like when there's other health problems, right? Like if there's diabetes in your family or, cardiovascular disease, right? There's a lot of things that we're holding, but it's a lot of stuff that like actually doesn't help kids learn how to eat, right? And like this idea of like, how do we bring more protein in the diet without like forcing someone, right? Like you must eat this, right? Like helping kids also, like when we talk about, gentle parenting or respectful parenting, whatever it is that you call it, this idea that you really respect your child. It's like, we all have different likes, right? And I love that you shared about your son. It's like, there's things that like are, especially like, and then I don't know if you follow this, like there's a Latina nutritionist that kind of talks about how, we should all be eating kale. And it's like, pero like, no, like kale doesn't grow everywhere. Like we've been eating, there's so many ways that we can eat our, our like cultural foods that is like, we've been invented this idea that cultural foods are bad for you, like by como default, and it's not true, or we've been invented this idea like, tienes que comer, ta, 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 ta. But it's like people that have a variety of different things with relationship to food. Like you can eat nutritionally in many ways. You do not have to eat like a white person to eat nutritionally. And so we do have to dismantle that piece about diet culture, this idea that like only, if you eat it this way, that's the only way that's good. And it's like, hello, like people have existed in all continents eating all kinds of things for like whatever, like that's absolutely false. And so, or like she did a recent one about like brown rice versus white rice, and she was like, the difference in fiber was like 1 gram, but you were told like oh my God, like you should never eat white rice again. And it's like, you can eat white rice, like
I know.
you don't have to eat like this other person, right? And then we now know our guts are different, right? Like you absorb different.
Yeah.
You and I could eat the same bowl of pasta and absorb a different range of things based on what your body needs, or if you need more carbs or you need more, we will extract that. Like our intestine will do that for us. Isn't that crazy? Like we just don't think about that because diet culture has like really really informed how we relate to food.
Girl, don't tell me about that brown rice stuff because my son will not eat it. He's a white rice kind of kid.
Yeah.
In the Dominican culture, we eat a lot of the arroz con frijoles adentro.
Yeah.
So he likes all that kind of food. How am I gonna go and be like, oh, here's brown rice now because supposedly it's healthier? No se puede.
No.
I can't. And I frankly, I don't feel like I should be putting that on him either. Like, he eats fine. He moves his body how he needs to move it. He's very intuitive with the way that he eats, and he listens to his body. When he's hungry, he eats, and when he's not hungry, he tells me he's had enough. And it's nothing that I'm like putting it on him like to make him feel guilty. Like, I know debes comer tanto. There's days that he's a teenager. There's days that he wakes up and he eats 4 to 5 meals a day. And there's days that he doesn't really feel like eating.
Yeah.
Y eso está bien.
Yeah.
De todos modos. Like, it's fine however he wants to eat. So, yeah, I really enjoy your platform and everything that you're doing. Do you have any goals, like, for the future, for the next 5 to 10 years? Are you planning on writing a book or continuing to do charlas and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to put more things in paper, and then more things in audio. And because my goal is really to create kind of different avenidas, different pathways into this content. And I'm still very committed to doing this in Spanish because there is a gap in terms of what's available and what's accessible and what's usable. And I there's also this particular goal, like that for me, to get more education around, Latinx community, because, the intersection between racism and discrimination for the Latinx community and fatphobia, especially in the medical spaces. I'm just really interested. The Latinx community does represent a community that is highlighted for like diabetes risk, but we can definitely work, towards a healthier community by actually eliminating the focus on weight. Again, like this whole thing is like, when people are like, you need to move your body this many days, but it's like, okay, but if you're not talking about where people live and that people have access to spaces to move their bodies, and like, when you, for example, in many places, they're like, okay, no comas tortillas, solamente come, ¿me entiendes? Something that people don't know how to cook, So there's a lot of ways in which we can really kind of dismantle diet culture for people. There's a fat activist that has this amazing like health sheets that are like, if you're a fat person that has diabetes or heart disease, like this is how you can receive care that is not focused on your weight, that is focused on like, what changes can you do in your life to improve your health? Like weight is literally not the question. It's just not. It's just like it's just like this reminder, that bodies come in all sizes and health comes in all sizes, and we must kind of dismantle that. But yeah, so in the next 5 years, I really hope to kind of like cement a little more of like more print and more audio for myself. But I still love social media. I feel like it's such I really appreciate, because I come from a health literacy background, I appreciate the idea of like distilling information into kind of little bite-sized, things that are very consumable. And a big part of my audience is Gen Z, like people who already come with a different perspective, but they're still like seeking this information. So, I hope to continue that. At the same time, I think we don't know what the future of social media and these platforms are, but I do appreciate the idea that it's like it makes it more accessible for anybody, but also anybody who's listening can start their account, they can start learning. So, but I want to really be kind of a source of information that helps create a world where all bodies fit. And my most like more immediate plan is a curriculum for right now TK or pre-K to second grade around body positivity. And my child is young, and so I want to do that and I want to test it out. But I want it to be bilingual because I do feel like there's a bunch of people who are kind of not getting this. They're just not getting any information that their bodies are good. They're getting information about some places like your hair is good, okay, but like, tell me my fat body is okay. Tell me that as I am, I'm okay. I'm a good person. I deserve to, find love and have a good job, all these things, right? Because that's one of the associations around fat phobia, that like fat people don't deserve these things. They don't deserve to be happy and loved and more. So yeah, I mean, I really, I also love audio, and I really hope that someday I can launch my podcast. There's also lots of things happening in the podcasting world that are sometimes hard. But yeah, those are my goals. And as my child grows, and I think that's why I kind of really appreciate your perspective as well. As my child grows, there's like the program has to grow, right? The idea of like, how do we talk to older kids, and how do we talk, how do we help someone who already is like in a dieting space? Because let's be truthful, like parents have a lot of influence, but really friends have a lot of influence, and so, and you're not, everybody else has different ways of growing up and thinking, and it's not going away, right? Like body related discrimination is not going away. So how do we empower our kids? And then I want to end with that, like the idea, like a lot of people get me riled up. They're like, you can love your kid or show them to love themselves, but they're going to get bullied no matter what. And it's like, yes, they're going to get bullied. This is the truth. They're going to get bullied no matter what. So how do we help, the idea of like not bullying, and I mean like there's ways of like combating bullying, but the idea of like using body to criticize people, it's something that happens. But how do we retain our sense of worth? And that's where I'm putting my energy. I also think like, yes, like centering body diversity throughout, like I feel like, yes, school curriculums should have a sense of, like we talk about good foods, bad foods, and it's like, oh, already my son who's 4 is like, oh, that shark ate too much, that's why he's fat. I'm like, that's not how it works. Like, because that's how what we do in schools, right? And especially for Latino kids, and also Black kids, I feel like they're just like, we get bombarded with these messages. So there's just like a lot of places to go, and I want to continue learning. There's just so much to learn, honestly, Marcy. Like I always say, like as soon as you start questioning one thing, you're like, let me look at the research on diets, and you're like, oh my goodness, okay, let me look at this other thing, and it's just so much to learn. There's so much to learn, and so much to dismantle.
Mm-hmm. We always go into these rabbit holes. Once we start researching, it's like you don't know where to stop, because it takes you to all these other different avenues. As a teacher, though, I feel like I try to enforce body positivity. The thing is that I don't feel not comfortable. I don't feel confident that is happening for my son in his school. So I definitely really support what you're saying, like teaching them to be whole in themselves, and then not to let other people's opinions about their bodies really affect them in that way that is going to take away from their self-worth. Because, we teach them a certain way, and then they go out into the world and they're faced with all these other things that are going on, and it's systemic, like you said. It's something that, we're putting in our 2 cents and putting in our grain of sand and trying to, change it in one way, but definitely teaching them to advocate for themselves also, and to speak up, especially when they see things that are not, that don't rub them the right way, so to speak.
And also, I think this,
last question.
sorry. No, I was going to say, like, My son is very is more on the quiet side. So, he will never, like, I don't think right now, he would not, like, kind of, confront anybody who's being a bully around bodies. But I was going to say, like, and also, in families, cuando hablamos de familias, like, sometimes you can't really change a la abuelita, you can't stop them from saying these things. But I want to say, like, we can always continue learning at home. Like, we don't necessarily have to do the learning in the moment, this could happen or something happens. You can always bring it home and be like, a ver, ¿qué pasó? How do we think about this? Because, like, not everybody's going to be the fighter. No, not everyone's going to be the this, but there's so much learning that we can do. So, I'm sorry, te interrumpí.
No, está bien. No, but seriously, it's just so much work to do. And then the thing is, like, when you really think about it, like how you were putting it into perspective, it does have to do with race and colonialism. Like, all of these ideas of the European standard of beauty that we've been fed, that our bodies are not enough, or our bodies are lacking or deficient in a way, it's all external. It's not how, like, our ancestors, let's say, were socialized at the time. But, definitely continuing the work is amazing. And what you're doing it just makes me so happy. So I wanted to ask you one last question. How do you make sure that you tap into the divine feminine and into your sexiness and sensuality even after becoming a mother? Because I feel like, especially in our community, we disassociate sometimes. Once we become a mom, it's kind of like, we're told, like, ya, you're not a woman anymore. Ya, no solamente eres una madre. You're only a mother.
Yeah.
So how do you help yourself, like, tune into the sensuality and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle to go back to sex, for example, after having my child. And it took that to kind of understand that sexuality and sexual power and the feminine power are not relational. Like, meaning I have them. They're in me, right? They're not, whether I have sex or don't have sex, that is still within me, right? And so it took a little bit of, like, I was not able to have sex for a long, long time with my husband, to kind of separate that, right? Like, our sexual life is not the same as my center, right? And that that took me a while. Oh, pardon. You're gonna say something more?
No, yeah. I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah. So learning more about that and kind of being able to, like, I had to learn a little bit more about things that were going to work for my body now after having kids. I think also, there's also this piece, right? I think that, as I said before, about our society kind of like being like, when are you going back to something, right? And it's like, actually, everything is different for me now. But because, like, pues ya no hay tiempo, the first, and in the first early years, my kid's 5, actually. I forgot to say before. He's 5. And, like, yes, like, days are busy. I'm touched out. Like, he's very mommy. But so a lot for us was like, how do we have intimacy and connection that isn't just like boom, 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 right? Sexual. And so that was one piece. And then, I recently was connecting with a Latina brand that does intimacy products called Bloomy, which I love because it's like woman owned and Latina owned. It's like really great. And there was a lot of stuff of, like, how to use how to use lubricants, how to use sex toys, all these things that kind of involved more like my own personal thing, right? It took a while for me to kind of, I feel like our society doesn't do a good job at the birth of a mother. We're like, oh, a baby was born, but it was like, I was born. I was reborn as a mom. And you're not understanding all these things that are happening for me, right? Like, I was talking to a mom that I'm supporting right now that she just had a baby, and it was like, my breasts, like, don't touch my breast. Right now, my breasts are food. Like, I will not think of them as a sexual part of my body, right? That took a while for me to kind of regain that connection and sometimes still I'm like, there's parts of my body where I'm like, this has changed. So if one thing that kind of like permeates my work is like, yes, change is literally the thing, right? And allowing, kind of like moving away from a guilt oriented thing of like being able to grieve the change. Yes, things are different. They're not the same as they were, but at the same time kind of being able to honor that change. And also, like, I don't know how old you are, but like I'm 42. There's a lot of other things happening, right? Like it's like this particular moment, how we've talked about, for example, menopause, how we've talked about, changes in all kinds of things that are happening in your body, right? As a woman, like we don't talk about those things because the only thing that matters is when you're 20, right? And that's such a falsehood. That is just poop, like it's just not true. So being able to kind of, I would say, like, also being in social media, and even though I'm like an older person, I do show up in the bikini. I sort of like own a little bit of that, without being kind of like too crunchy. But the idea of like, here I am with my arrugas and everything, there's a little power in that. And if anything, like when people kind of ask me like about social media, I'm like, yes, it's just powerful to be like, this is what I am. It's okay. Like, you see where I'm at? Like, this is okay. And that just like is suddenly very liberating. So I do a lot of stuff that kind of help me. I do a lot of aromatherapy and a lot of massages for myself. I do believe in like masturbation is a powerful thing for women. And now with our sexuality, with my husband, this idea of like, being able to schedule sex and sort of like knowing how important intimacy is, like it's literally as important as like doing exercise for me, because it's just an important part of my health for me. And kind of disassociating it from the raunchiness, like, ay, es que se te antoja. No, like, it's like, I need it. I need this part of my life. So all of that has been part of my work towards like really kind of acknowledging where I'm at and knowing where I'm at and celebrating where I'm at.
I love that. Gracias, Miriam. This was such a good conversation. I want to thank you so much again for being on the show. And I'm going to end the podcast how I always end it, which is follow me at Comadreando Pod on Instagram. And you can follow Miriam at, can you please drop your handle?
Yeah, La Gorda Feminista in Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Pinterest, and my website, lagordafeminista.com.
Amazing. Okay. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me a comadregram via email at marcy@comadreandopod.com or slide up into my DMs. Thank you for spending time with your comadres. Miriam, you're officially a comadre of the show. Welcome to the group. And thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night and be kind to each other.